Warm greetings from Indian Wells, California. My name is Sherry Mueller, and it is my privilege to serve as the president of the Public Diplomacy Council, and also to welcome you to this First Monday Forum. We are experimenting with our very first Zoom webinar as the platform, and we do it on a day of national mourning and a day of sadness and profound anxiety. Public diplomacy is all about building relationships at its core, and I trust that we're all thinking about how we build relationships both geographically and virtually. The First Monday Forum is sponsored by three organizations: the Public Diplomacy Council, the Public Diplomacy Association of America, and the USC Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy. Before I introduce Dr. Snow, our featured speaker, and I'm so pleased, almost 100 people have registered for this event, which is a super tribute to Nancy and her incredible reputation. Joel Fishman, the president of the Public Diplomacy Association of America, will offer some thoughts, and he will be followed by Katie Conti, a rising professional member of the Public Diplomacy Council, who has kindly volunteered to be our official host for this event. And you'll see that's a very important role, because Dr. Snow has asked that all of us raise questions using the Q&A function. Katie will explain more about that, so we're all on the same page. Joel, I turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Sherry, and welcome on this ideal late spring day from Washington, D.C. We have an excellent roster of speakers and programs planned for the next several months, which we will be sharing with you as soon as we have it fully staffed, fully complete. I just wanted to thank, we have two joint working groups, Joint Public Diplomacy Association of America and Public Diplomacy Council working groups, one on the programs, on the speakers, and the other on platforms. As you can tell from today's experiment with the Zoom webinar, we are trying out different platforms to see which works best. We want your feedback, so please share your reactions with us as we try to make this as responsive as we can for you. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Katie, who may be a rising professional with the PDC, but she's very much an accomplished professional at the Zoom controls. So over to you, Katie.
Thank you so much, Joel. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the First Monday Forum Zoom webinar edition. I'm happy to explain for you a couple of controls that we have available to make sure that you're able to engage in our event and with the panelists. So you'll notice on the bottom right, on the bottom center of your screen, you have a couple of options. Namely, you have a Q&A function and you have a chat box. Clicking on either of those will enable there to be either in the bottom right corner, the chat box, or popping up on the screen, a window for question and answer. If you could, we'd appreciate if you could reserve the chat box for voicing any technical difficulties or non-question comments that you might have, and you can address those to the panelists, and I will do my best behind the scenes to help you resolve those technical issues. And when it comes time to the question and answer, we ask that you please type your questions directly into the question and answer box. So again, click on the two speech bubbles that's at the bottom center of your screen, and you'll be able to type your questions in right there, and I will help forward them on to Dr. Snow. And without further ado, I will let Sherry introduce our wonderful speaker.
I've always wanted to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Nancy Snow, in part because she's an alumna of the school where I teach. She got her PhD at the School of International Service at American University. She holds a wonderful title the Walt Disney Chair in Global Media at Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University. Her permanent academic home, to the extent academic homes are permanent, is she is Distinguished Professor of Public Diplomacy at Kyoto University of Foreign Studies. She's a Professor of Communications Emeritus at Cal State Fullerton. Many of you knew her when she was a Presidential Management Fellow at USIA. She's been a Fulbright Scholar several times over. She's widely published. And Nancy, I'm so happy that you are here to talk about this subject matter, and I know public diplomacy in general. And we thank you and welcome from Syracuse.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'm glad to be on board with you all today. And I appreciate that we already have a Q&A. So we have a question already, and it's about China and how open and transparent China has been with its handling of the pandemic. I will get to that. There was also a question about the Walt Disney Chair. I don't know how many of you all are familiar with Schwarzman College. But it is now in its 4th year, and I already had an affiliation with Tsinghua back in '07. Tsinghua University is one of the best universities in the world, arguably at the very top of the universities in Asia. It is in Beijing, China. It's sometimes referred to as the MIT of China. And a few years ago, Stephen A. Schwarzman was approached by the then president of the university to replicate something, to model a program, an exchange program based on the Rhodes Scholars. And it was really an effort, a global effort, to try to build bridges between China, which we know to be such an important country in this era, even the pre-COVID-19 era. We were talking a lot about China and China's role in the world, and China was certainly asserting its role, its public diplomacy efforts and propaganda efforts around the world. So in that time period, I've been teaching in Japan as a public diplomacy professor. I went on a Fulbright in 2012, and then I started teaching at Kyoto University of Foreign Studies, which is a very small liberal arts foreign language oriented university. It's terrific. It's been part of the effort of Japan in its public diplomacy to go global, not only with attracting people from all over the world through the big rise in international tourists until the last few months, but also attracting young people from all over the world to come to Japan who may not necessarily even speak Japanese, but they have an interest in Japanese culture and they want to get a degree or spend a semester or a year at a Japanese university. So they can do that because I don't teach in Japanese, I teach in English. So I teach public diplomacy, global leadership, and international relations in my native tongue, and you can earn a 4-year degree at Kyoto Gaidai, which is our shortened name for the university. So at Schwarzman College, you can earn a master's degree in 1-year intensive program. It's taught entirely in English. 20% of the students are Chinese nationals. 60% are global. Of that, maybe 40% roughly will be Americans. So it's we're still very committed to the ideals of that program. I haven't even gotten to my prepared remarks, by the way, because I got caught up with that question. But since you asked about the Disney chair, I'm holding it this semester. And if it weren't for the COVID-19, I would have been in residence at Beijing for the 4 months of the spring semester. So of course, when the COVID-19 hit, I was in New York here at my home in the Finger Lakes, and I was getting ready to return to China, but we were asked to shelter in place. and I was scheduled to teach public diplomacy. Well, as soon as I could see what was happening, I knew that my students, even though we had a small class, we needed to shift our attention to what was happening in the world. And the reality was they were also sheltering in place. They had to deal with this new reality, the Schwarzman scholar. So we called it Public Diplomacy and the Pandemic. And we focused on not only the parameters of public diplomacy, but also what was happening in the information sphere. I published a book in Japan called Japan's Information War. And before that, many, many years ago, I published a book called Information War that had to do with the Bush administration response to 9/11. And Japan's information war is more about the response of Japan to the post-3/11 era, which had to do with how Japan adapted to and responded to the triple disaster that they call 3/11, the tsunami, the earthquake, and the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. Well, as we know, 3/11 in the United States and around the world was when the World Health Organization on March 11th declared a global pandemic. And what we saw, sadly, was a resurgence in nationalism. I'm not talking about nation branding, but in what we do in public diplomacy, we often focus on international cooperation, international organizations, on world expos, on arts exhibits, and ways of opening up people's minds, of connecting people across borders. Well, we know now that the pandemic cares less about borders, but ironically, people within borders, especially the political leadership, are caring more than ever about borders and closing borders, or ostensibly closing borders, and in turn closing minds. And so I've been greatly concerned, as have my students, with the rise of the information wars at place, not only between the US and China, but also between the leaders of countries. There's a new competition at play, as if we can have a winner at the end. And I've been saying in the last several months, as I've been at home, and I really literally have been at home, very rarely have gone out since mid-March, that we need to kind of refashion what we do as public diplomats and really embrace our work and stand up as leaders in our own right. Because I don't know about the rest of you on this call, but I've been disappointed largely by a lot of the biggest names in political leadership. And I could name the American president for one. I'm a political independent, but I've become quite outspoken about President Trump and his lack of leadership, not just in the handling of the pandemic. This was unexpected. A lot of leaders had trouble managing that. But in the events lately, with no statement, no formal address to the nation, as our hearts and minds are so troubled now on this National Day of Mourning. In fact, when Dr. Mueller invited me to do this talk 6 weeks ago, I was very excited about it, and I wanted to share what we had studied in my class. But as we got together yesterday on our call to prepare for today, I shared with Katie and Sherry Mueller that my heart is very heavy today. So as much as I'm the eternal optimist in what I do for a living, I feel all the more emboldened to speak up, to share a point of view, to share a perspective. We have to, again, think of the skill sets that we have already as public diplomats. I tell my students in Japan, or my students I've had in Beijing, or teaching as I did several years ago in Israel. I taught a course in marketing foreign policy, and I talked about public diplomacy, and my catchphrase is this: we are all public diplomats in our respective talents, in our skills base. Are you a communicator? Are you a good researcher, a good listener? Are you involved in international educational or cultural exchanges? What is your strong suit? Whatever it is, you need to deliver more than ever now. I don't think there's a more important era for public diplomacy than right now. I'm sure I thought after 9/11 that that was the most important era. Maybe I thought it was the most important era when I was actually working at USIA and the State Department. But this is the biggest that I've ever seen, because the worry that I have is that the fissures in our society are deepening. And the worry I have is that the inequalities are growing. And we are seeing the pandemic is bringing to light the inequalities across race, religion, community, and whatever the different identities are in our society. We are not growing closer together unless we do something about that. And by that, I mean you have to believe that there is something to unite us. I was reading Nick Cole's book, Public Diplomacy, and he talks about, he references his young son who had to defend public diplomacy in school. And one of his peers said, you know, what has public diplomacy accomplished? And his son said, well, we've never had World War III. And so the idea is with public diplomacy, it's primer paint. It is the efforts that we make on the front end to put in place measures to build mutual understanding, to further our sensitivities to other cultures. It's one of the reasons that I chose to live abroad. Most of my time is living abroad now. And it seemed like overnight, of course, globalization, as so many of us, was taken out from under us. I don't think it's going away for good, but I know a lot of the privileges that we had have been taken away. And we need to adjust to that and still work to make connections like we're doing now. This is something very different. I'm very comfortable in a classroom. I like to see how people respond. And right now I'm just looking into the camera and I'm not getting a feel for how people are reacting to my remarks. But nevertheless, I still share, I still connect, because this is what we do. And each time we take a baby step in this new era, then we are making progress. We are building in a dynamism to what it is we do. And what is it that we do? I go back to the book that Nick and I published just a few months ago. Here it is. I'm sorry for my commercial mention of it, but ironically, I talk about Martin Luther King and his efforts 50 years ago, the last book he wrote, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? 50 years later, actually more than 50 years now, we're still asking that question. Where do we go from here? Are we going to have a global community? Are we going to have a community where diplomacy, much less public diplomacy, still matters and matters even more? Or are we going to relinquish the shared power that we have and give it up to those who want to deepen those fissures and divide us from each other? And why do some of these elements do that? Because it's about concentration of power. And there's no doubt about it, economic globalization has brought a concentration of power. I've taught media and politics for years. There's a lot of concentration of power in the media, but there is also a lot of concentration of power in government, in military. And diplomacy, meanwhile, just a few years ago, just to use the example of the United States, wasn't Fulbright. Those of us who had participated in Fulbright, at the Fulbright Association, we were lobbying to save the Fulbright program from a deep and drastic cut in its programming. Now, I'm not suggesting Fulbright is any kind of panacea, but it is a way to, again, get people across borders, the borders in our mind, as well as the physical borders, so that we can meet. And the ideal, of course, from Fulbright himself was not that we would all break out in kumbaya and all be friends together, but that we would have a better understanding of each other. And isn't that what we need more than ever? This is why I love public diplomacy so much, because the first thing that we focus on is the need to open up your heart, your mind, your listening ears, to find out about the other person, the other community, so that you can learn better how we can come together. In fact, I've completely thrown my notes aside, so I apologize. I wanted to talk about Japan, and I'm happy to do that in the Q&A. I've got a few more opening minutes here. Where I live in Japan, regarding the pandemic, if you look at the numbers compared to the United States, it looks like Japan is a success. And on the surface, it has been, certainly with the number of confirmed infections, with the number of dead from the COVID-19, under 1,000. I think it's 900 today. They've had a reopening of their society. However, what we have in common with Japan, just as we have in common with everybody around the world, is that the misery index, the personal misery index, continues to climb. So in Japan, they are suffering, even though they're not suffering perhaps at the level, certainly, of the virus, they are suffering when you look at the inequalities, those fissures that I mentioned. The economic feelings of insecurity have risen dramatically. There was a recent 23-nation survey, maybe some of you all saw, from Black Box out of Singapore, a marketing firm, that actually ranked countries and asked people in these countries. They asked them in April, so it was somewhat delayed, but I think the survey came out the first week in May. And it asked the publics in these 23 countries how good the leadership was in industry and in government. And the last country on that list, surprisingly, was Japan. But it wasn't a particular surprise to me, because before I taught my class online to the Schwarzman scholars, Japan was dealing with the Diamond Princess. And then, of course, waited until the third week in March to say that there would be a postponement of the Summer Olympics. So that delay really affected the public in Japan. They didn't know what the message should be in terms of how to thwart the rise of the virus. And they saw a lack of leadership at the top. And I think that's actually quite promising, that the government and industry ended up with these low numbers, because if anything, it shows that the public is more involved, is more participatory now in its own democracy than ever. That same survey, which was criticized widely when it was published by CNBC, because the headline was that China was ranked the highest by its own publics. Of course, you would have to question that somewhat, because the Chinese media is not open and it's more controlled, and they get a lot of government news. So even though when we're at Schwarzman College, we have more of an open internet there than they would have, than the average Chinese would have. So it didn't surprise me too much that the Chinese ranked their own government very highly at its handling of the COVID-19. But as far as the Japan success model, and since this is called Unmasking the Virus, a lot of it has to do with the cultural norms of Japan. That was a package out front, in case you heard that, sorry. in Japan, living there as I have most of the time since 2012, but I've been a resident since 2015, you see people in masks all the time, year round, especially during hay fever season, but also because people will wear masks and go to work. So unless you're very, very sick, people might have a cold, or they don't want to impact somebody they're working closely with. So they do that as a form of respect and altruism and some form of protection. So that was easily done. It didn't become a political hot potato like it is in the United States, where it's about civil liberties and freedoms. And it was much more natural. We saw the same thing, of course, in South Korea and in China. And that kind of mask diplomacy may actually bode well for that region of the world. I think as we go forward, again, I'm all about the global community, but East Asia is a place that is constantly in conflict and in motion with tensions arising from history, but also from China's rise and influence. This, of course, worries South Korea and worries people in Hong Kong, worries plenty of people in Japan. So there's always an effort to kind of outdo each other. And we see that happening even in that region, where South Korea got so much credit for its model of cluster tracing and testing people and having drive-through testing, and also giving people plenty of information on their phones to monitor them. If you notice, though, with South Korea, they had an uptick as soon as they said we've been successful. Then they reopened some large venues like nightclubs, and they got a reinfection outbreak. So we're going to continue to see that. But I go back to public diplomacy, and I want to quote Jay Wang, because I actually really loved his piece that he wrote very early on in the at the USC Center on Public Diplomacy blog. And he said in his article, Public Diplomacy in the Age of Pandemics, a prevailing mandate of public diplomacy is to deliver clear, consistent explanation of policies and intentions to the wider international community, with the goal of inspiring trust and confidence. As the world is watching, national reputation and credibility are on the line and will suffer real permanent damage if there is no courageous crisis leadership. So again, I'm probably in the hour that we have now, half an hour, I'm probably going to raise more questions than I'll have answers, because I'll be frank with you, I don't have all the answers. Every day this is changing, but I do know that public diplomacy is more valuable than ever. And I do know that if we stand up on the leadership skills that we have, and we raise our mantle in this field of international relations, then we will feel a connection and feel like we matter more. I worry sometimes with all the sidelining of diplomacy that we are diminishing from view when we should be coming into view, because of the emphasis on communication, on credibility, on leadership in a global context. And I think with that, I probably should wrap it up, because I want to have plenty of time for questions, and I'm sure you might have a few coming in, huh, Katie?
That sounds great, Dr. Snow. Thank you so much for such powerful words.
No, you can see I'm real low energy today.
No, absolutely. And thank you again so much to everyone who started to input your questions into the Q&A function. So as a reminder, please go ahead and type them right in, and I will address them to Dr. Snow. And if you have any technical difficulties, I'll try to reference those in the chat bar. So Dr. Snow, I think that we might as well start with the first question that we received from Mr. Michael Anderson. He asks, how do you assess how the People's Republic of China has been handling COVID-19? Has it been open and transparent?
Well, not absolutely, as I just mentioned earlier, certainly not. But this is where I put a great emphasis on exchanges and on having people be able to go and visit China for themselves and experience a markedly different system. There's no doubt about it regarding information. When you look at China in terms of public diplomacy, the public diplomacy is melded into the aims of the government, both domestically and internationally. So whereas here with public diplomacy, we might separate the two, public affairs and public diplomacy, there's no separation in China. So the Chinese, as we've seen in the last 10 years or so, have poured revenue into sharing their story with the world. And that story is one often of concealment and of surveillance. And we've talked about that very openly in my class in public diplomacy and pandemics. Now, what do you do with a different system? Well, I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. But you have to believe that at the level of the people, I know what the people like. I know that the people like openness. I know that the Chinese people like access to information. And not only that, they want access to information that they can believe. So I think in China, with the infrastructure, with the architecture being more controlled top down, you've seen in turn, in response, a rise in the netizens. And yes, some of them get punished. Some of them get made an example of, but there is a dynamism in that political economy, in that information economy, that tells me that we all seek freedom. We all seek information that we can trust, and that we seek people we can trust. And if we don't continue to extend a hand and have back and forth dialogue between China and the world, we will relinquish control of that dialogue to the top-down efforts of governments, not just in China, but in other parts of the world as well. So I would love to throw it to the crowd and open up a dialogue on that, but we could spend a good amount of time just talking about that. And again, when I first went to Tsinghua in '07, I really didn't know anything about China except its system. But what I discovered is that the Chinese I met knew a lot about my system and knew a lot about the world, because if you look at the patterns of study abroad and how many Chinese are going overseas to study, it's quite dramatic. The information inequality there, the educational inequality in terms of what we know about China versus how much the Chinese are getting to know about us. So I go to China because I have an interest in China, but in particular in the Chinese people. And the ones that I've met, we have a lot of common values in terms of that orientation, as I said, toward openness and toward freedom and transparency.
That is very important. And speaking of education in China, Quentin Lead asked a question about, given the uncertainty many United States universities have about opening up campuses in the fall to students, and with the administration recently announcing a range of actions against China and its citizens, including restricting Chinese graduate and postgrad students and researchers from entering the United States, can you speak a little bit about the potential impact that this might have to public diplomacy efforts and exchanges between the United States and China?
It's going to have a deleterious effect, for sure. Because what I worry with this, and thank you for your question, is a blanket policy. And I know that that is more efficient, but again, it creates these enemy images. And we've already heard the rhetoric. We've heard it coming from China, we've heard it coming from the US. So it's not just something that the US does or the US political leadership does. The Chinese government and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs there, they're much more assertive at taking a stance regarding what's happening, particularly in the US. And they won't like this policy, but what I worry about is how it's going to impact the student at that grassroots level, and also these universities that have welcomed so many of these students, welcomed them into the classroom. They've contributed to research here. I'm more for open borders when it comes to international education, but I realize that this is political hot times now. We don't just have hot zones with the virus, we have also hot zones in our thinking. And we're trying to sort of maneuver each other. And one of the ways you can do that is through these punishment policies. And not just build a wall, but now we're going to build a wall to education. And I believe in education, as I'm sure many of us do on the line, believe in the power of global education and consider myself a global professor who works in different systems. And I work with the system that I have. But yes, it's going to have an impact because all you have to do is look at the numbers. Let me just mention Japan. Last year, when we were recruiting to try to get some Japanese to apply for the Schwarzman College program, we had a panel at Sophia University with their Department of International Relations. And we brought in the vice president of the Japan Student Organization, and he had all this data about the incoming foreign students to Japan. What do you think was the top country at nearly 100,000 coming into Japan? They were students from the People's Republic of China. Now, how many Japanese were going to China? It was a trickle. It barely even emerged on the data sheet. So the Chinese were going to South Korea, were going to Japan. If not there, they were going on to Australia, the US, the UK. This has been our lives for many years. Now, to some people, that is threatening because, as I said, it's a different system. And we're talking in terms of what kind of information are they gathering, and are they getting proprietary information? Well, there are bad apples in every system. There are bad apples in every program. But do you just shut down the entire program because of that? We don't generally do that in our philosophy of openness and transparency. And we can still be really dedicated to educating on the value of this open society. You know, the Institute of International Education, the Council of International Education Scholars, CIES. I worked with these organizations closely when I was at USIA, and I saw how transformative an international educational experience was to so many people. It's not perfect, but to have a blanket policy like that, I find quite worrisome.
Absolutely. So we have a question now from Ambassador Brian Carlson, who asks about theories of public diplomacy, in particular in China. He gives the context that American public diplomacy emerged in the middle of the last century, just as America was taking a prominent, dominant position on the world stage. That's when USIA was founded, the time of the Fulbright-Hays Act, Voice of America was established, etc. It seems to him that today China appears to be taking the stage in a similar role. So he asks, does the Chinese government and intelligentsia have a unique theory of public diplomacy? And if so, how does it differ from the American principles and programs?
Well, it's going to differ due to its system, but I think they're using some of the same approaches. It's just more intense. So for instance, when it comes to broadcasting, international broadcasting, which when we relate it to Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, we often think, oh, that's very 20th century. Well, China has put its greatest emphasis on broadcasting, on the visual medium. on film and television. All you have to do is look at this wolf warrior diplomacy now that we're talking about. That goes back to the biggest pop sensation in film in China's history with Wolf Warrior, which I haven't seen, but it's almost like a Rambo type or Dirty Harry kind of film, but it plays into patriotism. So China believes very strongly that its story has not been shared with the world. And I agree with that in terms of its broadness, its breadth, with all of the different languages, the ethnicities here. We have this idea of China as being monolithic. But just as I say the same thing about Japan, that the stories of Japan haven't been shared, many parts of the world feel like they know America because of not only USIA, but because of the footprint that we have culturally and economically and militarily. So they feel like, yeah, I know your story. Well, they still don't even know our stories. So with China, are they all on board together? No, I will share with you that I've talked to my public diplomacy friends in China, and they are worried about the over-aggressive tone of the government. Now, they share that with me. I don't know how public they are about it, but it's not as if everybody's thinking the same. They worry that they are overstepping, because all they have to do is look at the rise of China worldwide through the Belt and Road Initiative, the Silk Road, and the efforts on the open seas, and now even with the way that we have this digital economy is coming through the laying of cables on the sea floor. And China wants to be involved in all of that and with all the new technology. So the worry is that China, to these public diplomacy scholars in China, the worry is that the government will exceed its reach in terms of more of the control of the infrastructure, and there will be blowback to that in terms of anti-China, people not wanting to come to China, people not wanting to have that engagement that we value so much in public diplomacy. So don't think that there is of one mind when it comes to public diplomacy. By far, the amount of research that I'm seeing on public diplomacy is coming out of China. I mean, there's so many young people interested in public diplomacy and in persuasion and propaganda studies as well. And they certainly, I wouldn't say, since I wrote my first book called Propaganda Inc., it's not something that just the Chinese have, their own propaganda.
Exactly. And from my point of view, as someone who implements exchange programs focusing on African youth, I'm always fascinated to see about the relationship between China and Africa and the Belt and Road Initiative around the world. And I'm particularly interested, as are some of our viewers, in some of the soft power tools that they use, one of them being Confucius Institutes. So Bridget Surchak asks the question, what are your thoughts about U.S. college campus student groups calling for these Confucius Institutes to be closed in the U.S.? And would you mind giving our viewers just a quick overview of what Confucius Institutes are and how they play the role within China's soft power?
Well, Confucius Institutes are part of this persuasion, public diplomacy, propaganda, outreach of the Chinese government. And they were, by design, on paper, set up to be cultural centers where you could come and learn Chinese. But many universities have looked into how closely aligned they are with the government in China and have said, how free and open can our dialogue really be on a campus? So that's why there's been this pushback. And again, I'm all for having dialogue and debate on this and having a discussion about whether or not they're more propaganda than they are educational. And I've spoken about this a lot before, about the Confucius Institutes. it's interesting in that how many other countries could have that kind of frontline presence on a college campus. Not every country could do that, but part of it is that we have a natural curiosity about China. China recognized that and started offering, through fully funding these institutes, to have them right on the campus or just off the campus. And the universities accepted them because they were revenue enhancement too. And in part, it was due to the very large percentage of Chinese students, but also a growing percentage of international and American students. But the Confucius Institutes are all over the world. But there was a growing interest in China and in a rising China. So China looked at this as sort of part of the marketplace of ideas. But if you read any of my work, you know I'm about critical communications and critical thinking. And if you question the motive of the institution, you have a right to question it. You have a right to find out what are these funds being used for, and is there some programming that we can just not have, and why is that? So keep asking questions about the Confucius Institutes, but about anything else that you're not comfortable with, because that's the role of the university. And we're in part sort of having a university experience here now. It's just an open university.
Absolutely. And going off of that idea of making public diplomacy programming accessible, whether it's in a university or in another format, Jeffrey Simmons, one of our Public Diplomacy Council Rising Professional members and a current Rangel Fellow, asks the question, what happens to public diplomacy what happens to public diplomacy programs in communities with minimal internet access if our solution to this current crisis is to go digital? How can we ensure that communities with little or no internet access aren't excluded from our programming opportunities and engagement? And from my understanding, that might impact, in particular, many Asian audiences and members of the developing world who might be trying to access these public diplomacy programs as well.
Well, it's impacting across the board, and it's even impacting, as I mentioned, the Schwarzman Scholars Program. It's a very elite program, of course, and there are thousands of people who apply for about 130 positions. But some of those chosen are from developing countries. They're from small villages. Do you think that I had those students in my public diplomacy and pandemic class? No, I tried to, but we didn't have the digital connection. They didn't have the ability to connect and have high-speed internet. And so we lose out on their contributions. And I don't think the answer across the board is the digital economy. As I said earlier, inequalities are really coming into the foreground now of this new reality. We're going to learn as we go along, but we're using the tools that we have. I have a lot of tools that many people don't have, so I'm going to use the tools that I have, but it doesn't stop you from taking the international to your community. Is Cynthia Enlow, I referenced her in a piece I recently published at the USC Center on Public Diplomacy about feminism and soft power. And I quoted her where she says, the international is personal, the personal is international. Well, when it comes to communication and to public diplomacy efforts, get involved at the local level, offline. You could have a few people around a table and form a public diplomacy study group. I'm not kidding. Study groups in general are so popular in Japan. I don't know if anybody knows this, but across all the universities that I've associated with, I will meet people and it'll be 4 to 6 people who will come together on a Friday night, have a drink, and talk about whatever subject of interest we have in common. And these study groups you can do across the globe, in the smallest village, in the largest city. So don't be discouraged by the lack of infrastructure. We need to get there, certainly. And I think some of these large box tech companies have to really get more altruistic in giving to these disenfranchised communities. There's no doubt about it. But in the meantime, there's no substitute for each one, reach one in the community. And so I would encourage people. I have had the experience in this pandemic of feeling more creative than ever. And we can talk about all the downsides of this, but at the same time, crisis really can incite creativity. Crisis can incite new ways of thinking. And that's what my hope is, that we won't go back to our old normal, because our old normal wasn't that great, really. I mean, we were battling each other, and we're still in somewhat of that old normal thinking now, plenty of it, I believe. So we can create an alternative, but we do this from the grassroots up. And that's why I'm often critical of the top down and this sort of trickle down political empowerment. It's not working, certainly in gender equality in Japan with Womenomics. Japan's ranking in gender equality is at its lowest level in its history, despite all the rhetoric. So I would encourage people to look within your community and identify ways in which you can connect with each other. And that's public diplomacy. That is an effort to inform, engage, and influence.
Exactly. And now we have a question from Leonard Leakin. He asks again about Japan. How would you compare the level of trustfulness of the public toward their political leaders in Japan and in the US as pertaining to the COVID-19 guidelines and how they're being adapted and actually implemented in communities?
Now that sounds like I set him up to ask this. If you're interested in this, would you all go to my website? It's just my name, nancysnow.com, but I have all of my essays that I've written in the last 4 months. But they look at this, and the last one says Japan's government gets no credit for the coronavirus. And it wasn't me wagging my finger. It was really saying the public is not giving credit to the Japanese government. In part, it's because what's built into Japanese society is a shared trust. But that starts when you are in kindergarten, even before that. There's a social contract. You are taught that caring for others, being mindful of others, is part of what being a good citizen is. And that's across the board. Every Japanese child gets that. In the home, in the school, it's reinforced constantly. So how the Japanese people may feel about the government, well, the numbers are going down for Abe, but part of it is that he's been around a long time. They're used to prime ministers who kind of rotate more often than he has. He came in 2006 for a year, then he departed, and then he returned triumphantly in December 2012. And he's now the longest serving prime minister. And there were so many promises made to the Japanese people that 2020 would be the breakout year, not just in the Olympics, but in terms of getting up to 30% of all of the leaders in the corporate C-suite, make sure that they're women, and to make sure that we will have 40 million international visitors. You can imagine how the country has had to deal with all these setbacks. So the political leadership is going to be an easy target, but I think too, there's a lot of apathy about politics because the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, and it's not liberal, but it's called LDP, has been around since the mid-50s. And there hasn't really been much change. It's like the same party, the same people. And so you don't generally have a lot of heated discussions about politics in Japan. So in that indifference, though, and this is why I credit the Japanese people for their success with COVID-19, is that they were already doing things that they do naturally. They have what they call the 3 C's that the government touted, but they're just sort of common sense. And that is to avoid closed spaces. So you don't want too many people on the elevator, too many people in the subway. Most people are taking public transportation. Avoid mass crowds, and then avoid close contact. And the only part where they lapsed, but it is Japan, was during cherry blossom season. And during that period, the government's messaging was very mixed. They had a long weekend, and the government had not yet issued a state of emergency. So there were a lot of people gathering en masse, but I don't even blame them there. So again, with that trust that's built into the cultural DNA, it was a natural behavior that people invest in. And it's one of the reasons I love living there, is that there is this respect for the other, the stranger, that you just naturally engage in, almost unconsciously. And it's something that I've learned to model. I think it's made me a better person, actually, living in that environment. I don't know, you guys have to decide that. So.
Absolutely. So we now have a question from Ambassador Cynthia Efford. She asks about international leadership in health diplomacy, saying, the US has been a leader of the international health community through the CDC and our close work with the World Health Organization. Is there any way that a future administration can regain that role, or have we relinquished it permanently? In your point of view, what can public diplomacy contribute in the short term or longer term?
Well, thank you for that wonderful question, Ambassador. And I not only support what you're suggesting, but I say, let's get to work. Let's roll up the old sleeves. Let's make international public diplomacy a star from the US. I don't know, I worked at NIH when I was in grad school in DC. I also was part of a program at the CDC many years ago, but I really support, obviously, public health workers, but also those who are advocating for public health internationally. And the US should be at the forefront of this. So how do we do it? Let's connect with each other and let's make it happen. Let's write about it. Let's advocate. Let's do our research too, to say, we have been a leader, we can be a leader again, and we're actually going to bypass some of the rhetoric that's illogical about delinking from the World Health Organization or disregarding the data from the CDC. It's illogical. It doesn't make sense, those kinds of pronouncements. So it's like I often say, if you don't say anything, then that's where the information will concentrate, in these illogical centers. So you've got to speak up and advocate. And I do that with the pen.
That is so important. And jumping off of that point on leadership and rhetoric, Ambassador Greta Morris.
Oh my goodness.
Sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble with my video. Well, Ambassador Greta Morris asks, what kind of messages should political leaders in the United States and around the world be giving now, but especially in the United States, dealing with both COVID-19 and police brutality and the murder of George Floyd and resulting demonstrations? Are any political leaders, either here or overseas, giving these kind of messages, and what should they look like?
Well, I'm just going to answer that in one word, and maybe two: empathy and understanding. And let's make that contagious, because right now at the very top, there's a lack of empathy, and that's clear. And so again, are we going to rely on having the political leadership that we have in Washington, and we're in an election year? We can't even wait for the election. We can do something now, and that is to challenge the lack of compassion and understanding and empathy out there. and we can put out a different set of values. You know, Joe Nye just wrote about the history of morals and foreign policy. And this is what I wrote in response to his book about kind of a feminist or a woman's perspective on this. And I know what I want to sort of grow in my field, and that is more of a gendered interpretation of foreign policy and public diplomacy. But that's just me. I go back to what I said earlier about your skill set. An ambassador has an amplification that I don't have. And I think the ambassadors who are on the line here know instinctively what messages that we're not spreading. What we're spreading right now, unfortunately, is shocking the world. And that is the idea of kind of every man for himself, every woman for herself. And, you know, watch your back and live in fear. Do we really want to live in a society like that? I don't. I want to engage. I want to find out what's going on. I want to understand how people feel differently based on race and religion and ethnicity and geography, and get away from these sort of power trips that individuals go on. So there's no easy answer here, but it's clear to me that there is a lack of pro-social values that have to do with, again, community building. And that's why I say living in Japan, there's no perfect society. Japan isn't perfect. I don't hold it up as a perfect model. But the fact that I can, again, a woman of privilege, a white woman, Western woman of privilege, can walk around Tokyo, a metro city of 35 million, at all hours of the day or night. It's not just my race, it is also, and it's not just the fact that I'm not Japanese, it is also that it is a much safer society, going back to that mutual trust that people have. And oh yes, they don't have access to weapons the way that we do here in America. So we've got a lot of problems here. This is why I wrote about Edward R. Murrow in his efforts when he was director of USIA in the 60s. He said, if we don't address race relations now, it'll become a propaganda tool for the Soviet Union. And so in many of his speeches, he talked about racial discrimination in housing and in basic civil rights, even though it was at a time where there were changes and very promising changes. We never reach perfection. We never reach our nirvana. So we've got to always keep fighting for expanding rights and liberties to everybody.
It's so important. And we have so many questions from our audience today. Unfortunately, we don't have time to answer all of them, but they do ask on everything from, the impact on the American public diplomacy image from the pullout of America from the World Health Organization, to asking questions about the human rights record of China and how that goes into play with our public diplomacy efforts and exchange tools to coax China in a more intuitive approach. Another question about the future of Hong Kong, and so many other questions about key issues today that are right now in this moment very fueled.
Let me make it a rapid response round then.
Please, go ahead.
Both and girl. So if you can be both in favor of, as I am going to teach in China, am I pro-China? In that respect, I am. But you can be both and I can be concerned, critical of a human rights record of a country like China. And I can be critical of maybe the State Secrecy Act in Japan at the same time that I live there safely. I live there with respect because I'm a guest of Japan on a resident visa, so I can be asked to leave at any point. So there are ways that you can challenge, but do it in a diplomatic manner. Do it in a nonviolent manner. And it's why I began the first chapter of the Public Diplomacy Handbook talking about King, because I'm from that generation of being a little kid and being inspired by somebody who was from my neck of the woods, who happened to be from the South, where I'm from. And race has been a major part of my growing up experience. So the words of Martin Luther King, his great oratory, they moved me to want to be a change agent. So we all can be a change agent. And as you can see by these questions, that they run the gamut. Do I think it's that soft power, American soft power is damaged? It's the worst. It's the worst that I've ever seen. So soft power, you can enhance it, or you can in a positive light, or you enhance it in a negative light. But do I think that this is the end point? No, I don't. Because we're all part of the American experience. I'm a US citizen, so I can do something today to make an effort to enhance soft power and put it in a more positive light. And that's something that we can all do. And that's all I'm suggesting in this talk, is that we begin from where we are, that you are your own public diplomacy message embodied in your outlook on the world. And I choose to believe that the dynamism we have can lead to positive outcomes. I know that Nicholas Kristof, I think early on, wrote a piece in the New York Times, and he said, you know, with natural disasters, we seem to handle that better than we do pandemics. Pandemics bring out the worst in people. Well, that's true, but they also bring out the best in people. So it comes back to both and. And this is something that we have to see in ourselves too. This may have come from doing a 10-day noble silence meditation retreat that I did over the new year, when I thought I would be in Beijing and I thought I would be in residence there. And what that meditation taught me is balance, in everything balance. And I think right now with the pandemic is that we were seeing that we're off balance. We're off balance in our outlook. We're off balance in how much we value other people who aren't like us. And we need to work on that every day. But you can make it fun. It doesn't have to be a burden. It's part of humanity. And if you care about humanity, you do it on a daily basis.
And that's certainly something that as a young public diplomacy professional, I hope to definitely continue in my work, as I'm sure everyone else on the call will as well. So with that, I think we're just about out of time, but I'd love to bring Sherry back on screen.
That
Sherry,
felt
if you're
like
able.
10 minutes, by the way.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for your excellent questions and let you know that Dr. Snow has agreed to stay in the room for another 15 minutes
Yes,
for those of you who want to continue the interaction. And that's very important. Dr. Nancy Snow, Edward R. Murrow would be proud. And thank you for sharing your expertise. I can't offer you our signature cookie because they're home in Arlington in the refrigerator, but I promise to send you some note cards of photos taken during the pandemic as a token thank you for a splendid presentation. So with that, we're formally adjourned, but for those of you who want to keep the Q&A going, please stay on the line with Dr. Nancy Snow and Joel and me and Katie. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everybody. And now, for those who are still on the line, I want to just read 2 short paragraphs. And this is from Rethinking Public Diplomacy in the 2020s. We need to, in the spirit of King, find the larger meaning in what we do as public diplomacy scholars and practitioners. What is our mission? What are our collective goals greater than our individual selves? How do we put the chaos of the modern world into a global community context? We seem to be united on at least this. if you take the pursuit of public diplomacy out of international relations, then the world becomes more chaotic. Governments stick to their guns, literally and figuratively, and use bullets and missiles to do the talking. At our best, we are protagonists for global civic engagement and dialogue. And we have our foundations in the public aspects of diplomacy. And we have, you know, as I said earlier, I'm inspired by other scholars in public diplomacy, by practitioners, by people like yourself, Dr. Mueller, whom I came to see when I was in graduate school and trying to figure out what my dissertation topic would be. That was probably 1990. And I was 15, a child prodigy at the time. I'm kidding.
And I was barely 19.
But we go back all these decades, and I want to give a shout out even to your newsletter from the Public Diplomacy Council and how much I look forward to it. And I hope I don't get too emotional, but my mother was a wonderful writer, and she had such a skill in the turn of a phrase. And every time you write, before we get into what events are happening, you always have this message that just makes me feel so good. I always have a pull quote. You had the message, the poem that you shared. And I even had that in my formal notes. I had the quote from Mary Oliver, The Summer, where she says, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" And this is what I was trying to get across with my remarks today, is that these are certainly mournful times, but they are exciting times, and they are times where we can make a difference, and in very small ways, step by step. And I truly believe that. But I believe it because of the example that I'm given on a regular basis from so many other people.
Thank you, Nancy.
So anybody else for a question? I have no idea who's on.
Absolutely. We still have quite a few people who are with us. I know that one question we had earlier asked about your experiences working with USIA and what you think of public diplomacy now and how public diplomacy is going now that it's become more part of the State Department. Do you think it's more or less effective? And this question from Ambassador Greta Moore again.
Oh, well, thank you. And I appreciate so much being asked about my experience at USIA. One, I believe that experience in part gave rise to my writing career, because when I worked at the agency and at the top of the building, it said, "Telling America's story to the world," I thought, I wonder what goes on here. I had been accepted as a presidential management fellow, but that got me thinking about the larger questions about the official American story and the unofficial stories about America in the hinterland, in sort of the forgotten country. And so that's why I published my first book called Propaganda Inc., Selling America's Culture to the World. If you read that little book, that's probably been the most successful book I've ever published, because it came out in 3 editions. But it's because it was filling a void. And it's like I said earlier, that if you don't fill a void, then the void will fill itself. And so I thought, I've had an experience that's quite unique, that not many Americans have had. And I'm being paid by the American people. So I owe the American people my own take on USIA, warts and all, but it explained what the agency did. And then my hang up at the time, remember, I was right out of grad school, is that I didn't like the linking between cultural diplomacy and educational exchange and arts diplomacy with what I saw as a more Commerce Department approach in terms of defending NAFTA. And that was a big directive during the Clinton years that USIA got involved in that. So I was more critical of that, but that's just my point of view, and it's open to interpretation. But that little book has been published in a number of languages, and I think it's helped to put into perspective that indeed America has a propaganda history of its own. All you have to do is ask somebody overseas because they often will say, you know, you Americans, you don't like to acknowledge your propaganda history. But I explained that what we did was open source propaganda. You know, we were not the unsourced sort of propaganda that kind of raises alarm bells. We did things very much out in the open. Now, I will say, though, after 9/11, some may remember the Shared Values Initiative. And I remember going on MSNBC with one of the people who was featured in these ads. There were 5 ads. They were the brainchild of Charlotte Beers, who was the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy. And I think in the split screen, it was me and then the baker. There was, each one of the ads was promoting a different value. So in the case of the Muslim American baker, he was promoting entrepreneurial values. And I had no issue with the ads. They were accurate. These were real people. My issue was that they were answering a question that nobody outside of the United States was asking. No one really cared how happy Muslim Americans were. They were more concerned with what US policy would be post 9/11 vis-a-vis intervention in their own Muslim majority countries. So it sort of bombed as an advertorial because, one, it was seen as paid propaganda, but 2, it didn't really have the impact that it might have otherwise had. I know Charlotte Beers went on C-SPAN, held a news conference, and she said, I think these ads would have worked better if they were the start of dialogue, as opposed to just being an answer to a question that nobody was asking. So she was using her skill set because she was a Madison Avenue legend. She was studying her whole tenure at J. Walter Thompson and Ogilvy and Mather was studied at Harvard Business School. So she was excellent in what she did, and she knew advertising best, but it just didn't have the impact that it might have had they put a dialogue agenda on as part of it.
That really is fascinating. And I definitely want to look more into this dialogue agenda and how it's manifested in public diplomacy over the years. Now, we did have actually one kind of logistical question, or 2 actually. One question asked if there will be a recording of this available. And yes, there will be a recording of this available. We'll put it up on the, yes, we'll put this up on the Public Diplomacy Council YouTube page, and hopefully Sherry can send that out in either the event recap or the next Public Diplomacy Council weekly update. And then also, my colleague Mark Rebstock from...
Yeah, excuse me. I'm sure Joel will also find good uses for it on the Public Diplomacy Council of Public Diplomacy Association of America website, right, Joel?
I think you're right.
Okay. Katie.
Wonderful. Sure thing. So my colleague Mark Rebstock from Meridian International Center did ask also. He loved the passage that you concluded your remarks with. He'd love to know where, again, that was from, and if you could share it, if it's online somewhere. I think that's something many of us would love to refer back to.
What I just shared is in chapter 1 of the 2nd edition of the Rutledge Handbook of Public Diplomacy. And it's rethinking public diplomacy in the 2020s. I will say that I don't know for sure, but I have a feeling that we don't mention pandemic in here. And do you know, in the 1st edition of the Rutledge Handbook that I did with Phil Taylor, We did mention Barack Obama, but sort of in passing, because as you know, when you do these books, you have to turn it in so far in advance. And I believe we turned in the manuscript for the first edition long before Barack Obama was really gaining momentum as a presidential candidate. So that was brought to my attention when the book was released, that, you know, why don't you mention Obama? And I said, you know, it's the publishing process. So we have no chapter in here on public diplomacy in the pandemic. But what we do have, when I had to reflect on rethinking public diplomacy, I wanted to make sure it wasn't just stuck in 2020, but that we were thinking 2020s, the whole decade ahead. And it's easy to get down about 2020 and feel like, well, you know, the future is looking bleak. But I go back to my meditation again, which is all we have is right now. This is what we're living in. But you can certainly think about those who've gone before, and we still have the inspiration that I drew from, in this case, from Martin Luther King. And that book, Where Do We Go From Here, which I read in graduate school at the School of International Service. I took a whole course on Gandhi and principles of nonviolence. And so we read a lot of Martin Luther King because, of course, he drew inspiration from Gandhi. And so you see how all of these start to connect after a while. And ultimately, we end up bumping into each other everywhere in terms of influences. So that's what I'm suggesting to help kind of spread peace and goodwill. We certainly don't have to worry about overdoing it.
That's for sure. Use a lot more goodwill these days.
Yes.
But thank you so much, Dr. Snow. I'll echo one comment we received in the Q&A from our colleague Patricia Harrison from World Learning, saying, I want to share that I have greatly appreciated the honesty behind Dr. Snow's remarks and her thoughtful responses. This has been an excellent program. And I myself, and I'm sure for
my notes.
this has been absolutely fantastic, and thank you so much. So thank you everyone for joining us. Dr. Snow, do you have any final, we have about 2 minutes left. Do you have any final remarks, or Sherry? Otherwise, we're about ready to conclude.
Well, I think Sherry would agree with me that it is always a privilege to be able to have people online and want to come and hear what you have to say. But what I'm encouraging people to do is to take it and run with it. You know, I mean, this is just a moment in time, and I gather so much again from others. So let's spread the good message of public diplomacy, the actions, the values, the messaging, and promote more credibility and give people a sense of calm in very, very turbulent waters. And again, I want to reflect on this being a national day of mourning. My heart breaks for so many who are suffering, and to a much greater degree than I am. And so I just appreciate the time that people gave to me. I appreciate that.
Dr. Snow, thank you so much. A reminder for those of you who want to know more and read more, nancysnow.com is her website. We all learned a lot, as we always do. I think Nancy would approve if he would go out and write some letters to the editor and some articles and use that wonderful skill set people in the field of public diplomacy have. And on that note, thanks to all best for now. We're adjourned.
Thank you.
And this is Joel.
Hi, Joel. Thank you for being on. And Katie, you did an excellent job, and Sherry.
And I just want to remind everyone that we'll see you on July 6th.
Wonderful. I'll be there.
Nancy, thank you. That was
You're
so
welcome.
good.
Sure.
All best.
I'm going to stop the recording now. Wish me well.